Okay, let me try it again. Welcome to the Spring 2025 Weather Outlook with Jeff LIndner. Uh, we're going to record this session and post it up on our YouTube page and South Texas Cotton and Grain Association YouTube page. And we'll also share the link out to folks that weren't able to join today. So, Jeff, I will turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, sir. So, yeah, it's been an interesting, spring so far across South Texas. This graph is the rainfall departures for March, and minus that last week in March, this was a very different graphic up until that last week of March, and then we had that storm system come through northern Mexico and deep South Texas and produce all the flooding rainfall down there in the lower Rio Grande Valley, 18, 19 inches of rain in the Harlingen area in a 48-hour period. As a matter of fact, Harlingen, I believe, for the 48-hour period, recorded the most rain they've ever recorded in that. So that exceeds some of the big tropical events we've had down in deep South Texas, including Beulah back in 1967, which was a big flood event down there. So that kind of really helped with the big drought and rainfall deficits we were working with in South Texas. Did it end the drought? No, but it put a good dent in it, especially across the lower Rio Grande Valley. Elsewhere, though, it's been relatively dry. You know, we were dealing with a lot of fire weather concerns during the month of February, and we've dealt with a lot of wind this spring. We've had a lot of strong southerly winds with storm systems generally passing to the north across the southern plains in Oklahoma. And then behind the cold fronts back in February and March, we had a lot of strong northerly winds, gusting up 40, 45 miles an hour, which brought a lot of dust and fire weather concerns to the region into March when we were very dry. And so the good news is we're kind of pulling out of that now. We're greening up. The spring green up is well underway. That rainfall we had in the last week of March really helped tap down the fire weather conditions that we've been dealing with for a while. And interestingly, going forward, it looks a little bit wetter as we get into May. Of course, May is generally a wetter month in Texas. So just kind of stepping back and looking at how we've done. This is July of last year, so it was a relatively wet late spring and early summer across coastal Texas. We had a lot of rainfall in May. Then, of course, we had wet weather in June, and then we had Beryl in July. And then really once Beryl moved through, the weather kind of quieted down and we kind of went towards drought conditions. So you can see here, the end of July, we had virtually all areas drought free. And then by the time we got to October, you can see the expansion, especially in the coastal Bend area up and through East Texas, into the drought conditions, severe droughts, and moderate drought conditions. And this area out here around the San Antonio area, Bexar County, back westward towards Del Rio, that area has been in kind of a drought for a long time. And this is more of a hydrologic drought where some of the water supply systems and lakes are getting extremely low. Canyon Lake, even up towards Travis and Buchanan on the Highland Lakes are getting extremely low. And one thing I'll point out, this is looking at the drought index from this year, April 22nd, and you can see we've continued to see expansion of the really bad stuff around the San Antonio area, back westward into Southwest and West Texas. We've seen a lot of improvement down in South Texas, of course, with the rainfall, and we haven't seen a whole lot of improvements across the brush country in the Matagorda Bay, Victoria area, the Crossroads area. And that's because you got rain in the last week of March. It was a little more spotty in those areas, but there just hasn't been a lot of additional rainfall since then. So it's kind of a one shot there that last week of March. And if you didn't get any, you haven't seen a lot of improvement. And plus, you're still deep in extreme droughts, anywhere from severe to extreme drought in those areas. So it's going to take more than one rainfall event to pull you out of these drought conditions. One thing I will say, unfortunately, is all that rain that fell down there in the lower Rio Grande Valley pretty much all ran off into the Gulf of Mexico. It fell below the water supply reservoirs on the Rio Grande at Falcon, and so there are still some very serious situations along the with water supply down along the Rio Grande at Falcon and Amistad that are running really low down there. So it's all about when you get into these heavy rains where it falls. Interestingly enough, we've really cranked up the rain here in north central Texas, and we're going to see a lot of improvement here on the drought conditions in the upper Brazos Basin and even the upper Colorado Basin. So for the first time in, oh, say 6 or 8 months, we actually have water moving now in the upper Colorado River Basin and Pecan Bayou up around the Concho River Valley. And some of that's going to eventually make its way down and toward the Highland Lakes. And so, additionally to that, that area looks pretty wet as we go through the next week or so. So we're starting to kind of turn the page here, I think, in Texas with respect to the droughts. It's taken some time to kind of saturate the grounds in the north central part of the state over in this Abilene, San Angelo area, to kind of get some runoff now being generated. And so that's a good thing. And you can see here, we still have really dry conditions back here in the Rio Grande Plains from Laredo up towards Del Rio and then out west. And you can see the generally improving. And again, a lot of this was that last week of March. You haven't seen a lot of rain south of, say, Corpus Christi to Laredo since that last week of March. We did have some activity here last week in the Victoria Matagorda Bay area. And going forward, the question is really going to be do some of these storm complexes in central Texas here over the next week or so make their way down into the coastal bend in the lower Rio Grande Valley? And also, this time of year, we start to get the activity coming across the Rio Grande from northern Mexico, and that can uh, lead to some rain out here in the typically drier areas of southwest Texas. And so we still have a little bit of fire weather concern, especially out west. And this is where the drought conditions are the worst. We had some really significant fire this year up around the Fredericksburg area. And then back down specifically around the Rockport and Port Aransas area, there was a couple fires and some homes were lost in that area. But I think we're kind of turning the corner here. A couple things are happening. The green up is happening. We're getting precipitation. And also the winds are slowly starting to back down. So as we move through May, typically the winds start to come down. We usually reach our peak winds in March and April. And, there was times where we were gusting 40, 50 miles an hour for a couple days in a row, ahead and behind these cold fronts that were coming through. And we've kind of pulled back a lot on that in the recent weeks. So the winds continue to weaken and hopefully getting down below 20, 25 miles an hour as we get into late May and early June. All right, so let's take a look at the sea surface temperatures and where we were at the start of last year, 2024. You can see all the warm water out of the Pacific, the central eastern Pacific. This is an El Nino situation. But we weren't really seeing the connection here in Texas with rainfall through our winter months of 2024. We didn't really start to see the wet weather and the wet pattern here until the May time of 2024. And then as we go into October, you can see a complete reversal here in the central and eastern Pacific. We went from an El Nino situation to a La Nina situation with that cool water there between South America and south of Hawaii. And so La Nina tends to produce dryness in the southern plains in Texas. And that's really what we got starting in October and then going in through, March of this year and April of this year. We've seen below average precipitation in much of the state and the issues. But this La Nina is really weakening, and we're finally, I think, starting to see the atmosphere respond to that weakening of the La Nina. So this is April of 25. You can see the cold water anomalies have generally weakened. There's still some out there in the Central Pacific. We're seeing hints here of warmer water anomalies showing up off the coast of South America. Is that an indication El Nino may be trying to come back? It kind of looks that way, but it's probably not. None of our significant climate models show a transition towards El Nino. They kind of keep us in that kind of neutral condition between El Nino and La Nina through the summer. And you can see here, this is kind of what we're showing. Still have some cooler waters out here in the Central Pacific and then warming closer to the coast of South of America. We'll keep an eye on this, but there's some factors going on that I think are going to kind of beat down some of that warming as we go into the late spring and summer. So this is the forecast for El Nino, La Nina. Here we are coming out of it, coming out of the La Nina now. And you can see there's no big strong signal here going in any direction. So we kind of creep up towards zero or normal, and we kind of hold that way through the summer and into the fall of next year. Maybe a little bit on the cool side, maybe a little bit below zero, so a little bit cooler water temperatures, but not significant. And this will probably have some impacts on our hurricane season in the Atlantic. Initially, early on, we were thinking we might be a little bit warmer out here, maybe up above zero, kind of closing in on El Nino conditions toward the late fall. That does not look like the case now. And so this probably will have some sort of an impact on our hurricane season Atlantic Basin. The other thing this is this there's not a strong signal here now in the southern plains for dryness or wetness. And so, if we were heading towards El Nino, I'd say we're going to transition significantly wetter as we get into the fall of 25. But that really doesn't look like to be the case. And so I think we're kind of seeing our pattern shift here in Texas towards a slowly more normal pattern. We're going to be seeing a little bit more rainfall because we've just been so dry here in this late winter into early springtime frame. So the next series of graphics are the outlook for precipitation for the 3 month period from May through July of 25. The first one here is the American model, the CFS. This is pretty aggressive. It has been getting wetter and wetter with every run that it's coming in for the outlook going into the summer. I'm not really sure what this is keying in on. It could be some troughing down here along the Gulf Coast. It's possible this model's picking up on some early season tropical stuff in the Gulf of Mexico that's kind of resulting in these big precipitation bullseyes, kind of one here in the southeast US and the other here in coastal Texas. And it's been extraordinarily dry also in the southeast US, the Carolinas, and Florida. And so this is kind of good news, but I'm not quite sure this is the right way. And I think we're going to have increasing precipitation, but I just don't know if it's going to be as aggressive as that model is showing. You see here the European model is kind of the opposite. It does have the signal here in the southeast United States, but kind of near average precipitation to a little bit below in Texas and coastal Texas. And so I'm leaning more in that direction of kind of near normal precipitation. And again, the good news is as we get into May and June, our precipitation it goes up anyways compared to February and March. Same thing here on the Canadian. It's not as wet as the signal, but it has near average precipitation here along the U.S. Gulf Coast. So it's not the complete dryness we've seen, but at least the potential here for some showers and thunderstorms. And when you kind of put all these models together, what's the average of all of them for the May through July timeframe? It's going slightly drier, but this is not significant. We're talking maybe a quarter to a half inch below normal on precipitation for this 3 month period. And so the good news really here is that it looks like we're at least going to see precipitation. It may not be above average, but it also looks like we're going to kind of get out of this what we've been in March and for a good part of April of really not seeing a lot of rainfall in the southern part of the state. And so we'll see how this transitions. I think we have some opportunities here in the next week or so to get some rains down in South Texas. And then we may kind of get into a lull period before we kind of turn our attention more towards our typical summertime rainfall, which comes usually from the Gulf of Mexico, from the sea breeze and stuff like that. And it doesn't look like so far what I'm seeing is high pressure is going to set up over Texas this year. It looks like high pressure may set up more across the southwest United States into the central plains and that would keep us a little bit wetter here along the Texas coast. And you can kind of see the transition or the trend here in the NOAA outlook of above average precipitation. They're kind of buying into this above average precipitation on the Gulf Coast. It wouldn't totally surprise me if this kind of got drawn back a little bit here towards the coastal bend and some portions of coastal Texas. With the dryness kind of anchoring over here in the upper portions of the northern, mid central, and northern Rockies, and even you're seeing above average precipitation in the Southwest. That's probably the onset of the monsoon season in the Southwest. And why do I even bring that up? Because if there's an active monsoon in the Southwest United States, that usually means some Gulf moisture is funneling up the Rio Grande area and reaching into the Southwest United States. And so that's a very favored flow here in Texas for kind of an active sea breeze where you get those showers near the coast in the morning and they move inland 4 or 5 counties and produce thunderstorms and stuff like that. And so that's where we get a lot of our rainfall as we get into the summer months, of course, minus any sort of tropical system. As far as temperatures go, we've continued this trend. I show these graphics all the time. There's nothing but orange and reds on them. This above average temperatures, not horribly warm, or above average. You can see kind of this bullseye here along the Gulf Coast. This is the same model that was producing the higher rainfall amounts, so it's going to be a little bit lower on the temperatures, obviously. But again, I think this is probably a little bit overdone. The European is much warmer with a 70 to 100% chance here of above average temperatures along the Gulf Coast and in Texas. This is not surprising. We've seen above average temperatures the last several months across the area. But it has not been an extraordinarily hot spring. I mean, we've had some days that have been warm, but for the most part, we've been running a little bit above average. Same thing here on the Canadian, maybe picking up on a little moisture here near the coast to keep it a little cooler. And then the average, again, kind of showing where high pressure looks like it's going to want to sit up this summer, a little bit back further off to the north and west. And so Texas here, coastal Texas, South Texas, kind of sitting on the southern edge maybe of this high, which really opens us up to moisture moving in from the east, sea breeze showers and thunderstorms, tropical waves moving in from the east, even disturbances rounding this big high coming out of the northeast that can produce thunderstorms that come in from the northeast at sometimes. And so the good news is this doesn't look to anchor maybe over the Four Corners or Texas like we've seen in the past. And I think that's why we have a little bit better chance this year of a little bit more rainfall into our summer months. And so here's the temperature outlook from NOAA going through July. No surprise here. And then the drought outlook, where we have drought, we're kind of expecting drought to persist. I think this is probably a little overdone, especially on the northern and the eastern flanks of this, especially kind of looking at the next week or so. It looks like we're going to get some thunderstorm complexes through this area here in central Texas into maybe the coastal bend areas. And then next week, maybe some stuff coming up here out of the Rio Grande plains and coming across as some complexes of storms. And so again, we need more of this. We need, regularly every week getting some rainfall to help bring us out of the drought conditions. What you don't see here is any kind of further development of drought. And that's kind of good news. And so kind of working at chipping away on the drought conditions we have locally, and really probably more importantly, is the water supply issues that we're dealing with in central Texas and back along the Rio Grande. I mean, it's getting to the point where some of these water supply reservoirs are getting extremely low. So additional rainfall will certainly be helpful here as we go into May. So generally speaking, kind of what we've talked about. I think the rainfall is kind of going to be a little bit closer to average. I'd like to see it happen before we start really getting into it, above average temperatures and swell moisture. And so I did want to talk about the hurricane season outlook. We're starting to get close now, about a month or so from the start of our hurricane season. And so this is last year's, the 2024 season, a very active season in the Western Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. Of course, here in Texas, we had Beryl around the July 4th holiday. And then we were really fortunate that we did not have any additional significant tropical threats. We really had no tropical storms or hurricanes in the month of August, which is very surprising. Typically, August is one of our busier months out of the year. That probably saved us here in Texas from a more substantial season. Because you can see the track pattern last year was storms forming here in the Western Caribbean, moving toward the west and the northwest, generally in the direction of Texas. And then because it was later in the season, they kind of curved back to the north and made landfall further to the east of us. And so we were really fortunate that we got away with only Beryl last year. But a very concentrated area here. And this was really shown in the modeling this time last year that this area looked like it was going to be a breeding ground for tropical storms and hurricanes. And kind of this continued pattern that we've seen the last several years of just not a lot of activity out here in the open Atlantic. Some of that's a function of a lot of dust coming off of Africa that's just choking these waves as they come out. Last year, there was so much rain in Africa and it was so wet that the waves were coming off way far north, way up here around 25 north. The water temperatures up in this area a little bit cooler, and so the waves were kind of vanishing as they came off the coast. And then the other thing in August, and the reason why we think things weren't very active in August, is there was a lot of warm air aloft, so up around 40,000 feet across the Atlantic basin. It was very warm last August, and so we're not really sure why. Maybe because the Atlantic was so warm. There's also still some hypothesis of the volcanic eruption that happened a few years back in the Southern Pacific, and that aerosol trapping up around 40,000 feet is resulting in some warming. But that's probably, more questionable because you would think that would be a worldwide phenomenon. You see the same thing in the Pacific, the West Pacific, and we didn't really see that. It was kind of an Atlantic phenomenon of what happened last August, why the season kind of shut down, and there's no real good answers. I think more than likely it's a combination of a lot of the stuff. The waves coming off further north, the instability was very low because of the warm air aloft, and the other thing is the entire Atlantic Ocean was really warm. And what you really look for in really active hurricane season is you have some portion of the Atlantic that's a little cooler, maybe up to the north, and that adds some instability there. And so when the whole basin's warm, you may not get as much instability. So kind of a weird situation we had last year with the hurricane season. But in the end, all the storms kind of came late September and October and even into November. And luckily for Texas, when they started coming, we were kind of already out of our season. We kind of end here mid to late September. All right, so this is the sea surface temperature anomalies right now in April. The good news is the Atlantic is not as hot as it was last year. As a matter of fact, the water temperatures here in this part of the Atlantic basin between Africa and the Caribbean are about a degree to a degree and a half cooler than this time last year. So that's kind of some good news. Unfortunately, the Gulf of Mexico, you can see, is still boiling hot. It just continues to be really warm. It has been for the last several years, which adds a lot of fuel, not only to tropical storms and hurricanes, but also the severe weather and the heavy rainfall potential. And we've seen a lot of that up just to our north and east in the Mid Mississippi Valley, the Ohio Valley, and now back into North Texas and the plains recently. And so this kind of feeds a lot of what happens up here to our north with this warm blob of water here in the Gulf of Mexico. So water temperature is not as warm. That's probably going to reduce some of the tropical activity in the Atlantic this year. And then as we look at the precipitation forecast, so you obviously need showers and thunderstorms to get tropical storms and hurricanes to form. And we're seeing some good news here also. So not only do we have slightly cooler water temperatures, but we have what is looking like drier conditions in the tropical Atlantic, especially here in the Western Caribbean, which was so active last year. Notice here, though, we're seeing a signal here off the southeast United States coast and into the northern Gulf of Mexico of a little bit of wetness or above average precipitation. And this does potentially look like one of those years where we could have some homegrown activity. And you're seeing the same thing here with the American model, kind of this area here from the Western Gulf across the Northern Gulf into the Southwest Atlantic. And this area tends to be kind of a favorite area for breeding tropical storms and hurricanes, especially early in the season and then again late in the season. And that's because fronts will dip down in here, troughs will cut off down in here. And so you get these storms that form right here in this area, kind of close to the coast. And we're starting to see an increasingly stronger signal for this. There was not much of a signal here when you looked at this back in January, but this is really starting to show up here as we get close to the season. So we're going to have to keep an eye on this. And maybe for the first time in a while, some more active Atlantic tropical stuff. But again, a very dry Caribbean showing up on this model too. So that's likely going to, cut down on some of the stuff. The Canadian here tends to be the outlier. It's just extraordinarily wet. This is probably way too wet through these areas, so we're kind of throwing this out as an outlier right now. And then you can kind of see the model average, dry through the Caribbean, kind of a signal here out in the mid-Atlantic for maybe some activity. And again, this kind of northern Gulf, maybe off the southeast U.S. coast for some stuff to develop. This is kind of showing up, and it'll be interesting to watch this signal as we go into May and June and see if this kind of holds on here. So, sometimes this is development, sometimes this is just a lot of tropical waves, and it could be the models are picking up, the highs further to the north this year, and it's just going to be more active here in the northern Gulf. It's not necessarily a hurricane, but there's just going to be a lot more showers and thunderstorms. Again, we talked about El Nino, La Nina, kind of a neutral condition, maybe neutral, kind of cool. And so I think that this is probably the one thing that does support Atlantic Basin tropical activity this year. So if you're kind of keeping track of the positives and the negatives, the El Nino phase is probably more in a positive phase for us, so it kind of supports more development. The water temperatures, while still warmer than normal, they're not as warm as last year. And then the precipitation looking ahead is not looking overly wet, especially in the Caribbean. And so when you put it all together, this is the outlook for the numbers 17, 9, and 4. The average is there in the parentheses. So 14 named storms is average, 7 hurricanes, and 3 major hurricanes. So a little bit above average, especially kind of on the tropical storms. And this may be a season where we get more of the little short lived tropical storms, the last 24 hours or 2 days. We didn't see a lot of that last year, which is why the numbers were not as high as we were expecting. So I think we ended up with 18 named storms last year, and a lot of the forecasts came out this time last year over 20 and up to 25 named storms. But that quiet August period and the fact that we did not see a lot of little storms that didn't last very long kind of cut back on the names and the numbers. The analog year, so this is similar conditions in the basin, water temperatures, pressure, sea surface temperatures, sea level pressures, all that stuff, El Nino, La Nina. And this is kind of what has happened and the impacts on the Texas coast. And so, actually, this slide is not updated. It's all messed up. So. We did not have Hurricane Rita in 2008, so the analog years are right, but I forgot to change the names over here. So 1999, we did have Hurricane Brett down in South Texas, ran into the King Ranch area. 2008, of course, we had, let's see, Dolly, Edward, and Ike. So we had a South Texas landfall, and then two on the Upper Texas coast. 11, our big drought year, we did have Tropical Storm Don that kind of vanished as it came into the Corpus area, and then of course 17 was Harvey. And so there's certainly some hits we've had in these years. Most of that has formed, almost all of it, minus Ike, formed in the Gulf of Mexico and struck the state of Texas. And so, again, that's kind of what we're sort of looking for this year is that potential for stuff developing in the Gulf of Mexico and potentially making landfall. So these are the probabilities for landfalls. So everything you see here, this is the 2025 probabilities on the left, and then the averages, typical averages on the right. And Texas down here at about a 70% chance for a tropical storm, 45% chance for a hurricane, and 18, 19% for a major hurricane. It's a little bit above average from what we've seen historic 30-year averages. But these landfall probabilities are about 10% lower than what we were seeing last year in Texas. And so we had, of course, Beryl last year. So I wouldn't necessarily say we're looking at a particularly active year in the Atlantic Basin, at least way above average. I think it'll be near average to maybe a little bit above average. But the Gulf of Mexico may end up being a little bit active, especially with storms that kind of develop in the Gulf and make landfall. And historically, if you look back, 75% of the hurricanes that form in the Gulf of Mexico strike the state of Texas within 60 hours. So, a lot of it's not the big ones that we see coming off of Africa. We can, those are definitely there, but the majority of our landfalls are ones that form in the Gulf of Mexico and hit. So, like for example, they're not your barrels that you see coming for 4 or 5 days. And speaking of which, the forecast, for Beryl was really not that great. If we remember back, it was kind of aimed at northern Mexico, and then slowly kind of transitioned up the coast there as we got later into the landfall period. So that's kind of the early look at the hurricane season, and hopefully a little bit better outlook for getting out of the drought conditions in South Texas, or at least chipping away at them as we go into the rest of May and into the early part of the summer. So with that, I'll take any questions. Anybody has any?
Jeff, I'm going to stop recording and then we'll ask questions.